Thanks to you all for being here. My name's Rana Foroohar. I'm a columnist and editor at the Financial Times and an analyst for CNN, and I am honored to be here speaking to Richard Haass, the head of the Council on Foreign Relations, about his new book, A World in Disarray, which I do have right here. And you know, I can honestly say I do a lot of moderating. I oftentimes do not read the whole book. I read Richard's whole book, and you really should too, because it is a great primer on basically the last 100 years of where we have been in geopolitics and foreign affairs from a US perspective, and where we might be going, which is what we're here to talk about. So we're gonna chat for about 30, 40 minutes, and then we're gonna open it up for some questions, and there'll be mic runners on the other side of the stage. Richard, I'm going to start by asking you to define the notion of a crisis of the old order. This is a word I think that Art Schlesinger came up with, right? And you know, what is that exactly, and why do you believe that we're in one?
Well, thank you, Rana, and thank you all. There's a certain difference between the preceding event and this one.
Yeah, third act to follow. We're not going to dance.
We're not going to dance or sing. The subtitle, and you're right, it's a ripoff from Mr. Schlesinger, is a twofer. When I talk about the crisis of the old order, I have in mind two things. One is the international order, and this is largely an order that was created in the years just after World War II, roughly 70 or so years ago, and it's the crisis there. But also it's the crisis in American foreign policy. We had an order during the Cold War. We essentially had a large degree of bipartisan support for containment. We didn't always agree on the particulars, for example, Vietnam, but the broad outlines were sustained. And here we are, a quarter of a century after the Cold War, and there's a crisis as to what America's role in the world should be. How much of a role should we have? How do we define success? What should be our priorities and so forth?
And so when we think about the trigger points as to how we came to where we are now, maybe you can kind of walk through, because one of the things that was fascinating to me is reading between the lines. We had an order during the Cold War, but you get at the fact that it was never really as solid as we thought, that basically we had a kind of a post-World War II order, and then since then a lot of things have been leading up to this moment. So maybe you can kind of take us through some of the high points historically.
It's more the low points.
Low points, right. There is good news at the end. We'll get to it.
Yeah, if you survive until the end, there's probably about a half dozen or so things that explain how we got from where we were to where we are. Some date back to the end of to basically Cold War, and when that ended 25 years ago. Some go back to World War II. In no particular order. The Cold War, very concentrated world, two centers of power, and because of nuclear weapons, it led both the United States and the Soviet Union to act with considerable caution. There are all sorts of implicit rules of the road. When the Cold War ended, that discipline ended. What we have instead is a world of multiple centers of power and capacity, and the rules and disciplines that used to guide the world disappeared with the end of the Cold War. That's one thing. Second of all, the institutions. Think about it. The UN, the IMF, the World Bank, and so forth. These were all created during or just after World War II. If we handed out pencil and paper, I would wager a large bet that not one of you would design a UN Security Council that looked like this one, with the 5 permanent members being Russia, China, the US, Britain, and France, not including India, not including Japan, and so forth. So there's that. You have globalization. Yes, we've always had a degree of it, but the scale of it, the intensity, the velocity and the volume of the flows across borders is truly staggering, of just about anything and everything you can think of. And a tremendous gap has grown up between the challenges posed by many of these flows and the arrangements that are in place. And then I think the United States has added to it in 3 ways. And in some ways, it's the current president and its 2 predecessors. And the reason I single out the United States is we were the principal upholder of this order. Order just doesn't happen in history. It happens only because of exertion. In this case, the United States was first among equals, really first among unequals. And what's happened over the last 3 presidencies is first George W. Bush, in some ways tried to do too much. And I think the Iraq War is the poster child of a transformational strategy in which we overreached. You can talk about that. Barack Obama, in some ways, was the overreaction to George W. Bush. He then underreached, for the most part. He underreached in particular in Syria after the red line over chemical use, but time and time again, he might have done things. He pulled all US forces out of Iraq after Iraq had been restabilized, was forced to reintroduce them, tied US forces in Afghanistan, not to conditions on the ground, but to an artificial timeline, again, signaling a lack of American staying power. He went into Libya with others, but then didn't follow it up, just hoping that order would somehow materialize in Libya, and so forth. So Barack Obama was in some ways the bookend to George W. Bush. And then we have now Donald Trump, who's different than both. He essentially rejects most parts of the order in both senses of the world, the international order and America's role in it. He is a disruptor. And he essentially does not believe the benefits of American global leadership are in any way offset, that the costs of American leadership are in any way offset by the benefits. So he, rather than being a champion of the old order, is now a disruptor of the old order. So the combination of structural things, and we could add other things like the rise of China and so forth, and American action and inaction, acts of commission and omission, have essentially brought us to a world in disarray.
All right, we're going to dig down deep into many of those topics and come back to Trump and the current administration. But let me ask you a bigger picture question first. When you think about the new order or disorder, disarray, how much of this was inevitable because of, as our friend Fareed Zakaria would say, the rise of the rest, just the kind of new multilateralism that's a result of the emerging markets having finally emerged, China's new efforts around regionalization, the EU, who knows what's going to happen with that now, but all of these things, and how much of it is really down to individual policy decisions within the US administrations that could have been different?
I mean, the glib answer is both. Some of the things were structural.
Yeah.
China was going to rise regardless, or as they say in Washington, irregardless of what the United States elected to do. The fact that institutions that were founded in one era didn't adapt, some of that is structural. But I think a lot of it is what we did and didn't do. I mean, I've now worked for 4 presidents, for President Carter, President Reagan, and both Presidents Bush. My biggest takeaway is almost nothing is inevitable. Virtually nothing is baked into the cake. And that's good and bad news. But human agency matters, and the ideas that people bring into the Oval Office, into the administration, the things they choose to do and not to do, there's almost nothing that is inevitable. So I actually think to a large extent, this would have been a more challenging world, granted, after the end of the Cold War. But the degree of disarray, no, actually, I think we've brought a lot of it about ourselves. You know, that old cartoon about Pogo, we've met the enemy and we are it.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of that. I think the United States has, in some ways, disrupted an order that, on balance, has been overwhelmingly to our own advantage.
That's really interesting, because I would say that the conventional wisdom right now is that, look, there are all these meta forces, inequality, challenges to neoliberalism, rise of the rest, that have led us to where we are. But what you're saying is, no, that we really could have done things differently. So looking back on your experience in these various administrations, can you give us maybe 1 or 2 personal points or stories where there was a pivot moment?
Sure. Okay, I'll give you a positive one and a negative one. How's that?
Perfect.
Just to bookend it. The end of the Cold War, 1980, interestingly enough, it was 11/9 of all days when the wall came down, just one of those little jokes that history plays on us. And one of the first great crises then in the post-Cold War period was the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait in the summer of '90, which, by the way, would never have happened during the Cold War because the Cold War was too disciplined for that. And the Soviets never would have let their Iraqi client do something like that. Anyhow, it happened. I was the senior Middle East person on the National Security Council staff. The first cabinet meeting after the crisis began, so this is the early days of August 1990, was a disaster. People were just all over the place about whether we should resist it, if so, how, and so forth. And afterwards, Brent Scowcroft and I and President Bush, the father, huddled. And I don't know which one of the 3 of us was more miserable. And the president said, we can't allow this to happen. I have to go off to Aspen. I'll be back. Yes, he hadn't thought about that. he was giving a big speech on American defense posture. It had been long planned. He and Mrs. Thatcher were meeting out here, and this is the summer of 90. And he came back. He and Scowcroft asked if I'd write a memo about how we ought to think about this, and I did. And essentially the three of us, along with people like Bob Gates and others, were on the same page. And the president came back, and a few days later is when he landed at the White House, and he was on the South Lawn, and he said, "This will not stand. This aggression against Kuwait will not stand." Well, let me just sort of say, a couple of days before at the cabinet meeting, that wasn't obvious that that was going to be the outcome. And I would just say, if someone else had been president, it's not axiomatic. Just think about it, that we would have sent more than 500,000 men and women across the world in uniform in the desert, park them there for 6 months, and then in the face of all these predictions that tens of thousands of Americans were going to lose their lives, which was what most of the pundits were predicting, that we were going to do what we did, and then we would eject Saddam Hussein from Kuwait, and then we would stop before we marched on Baghdad? I mean, if anyone thinks that was somehow inevitable, that those decisions were going to be made, both what we did and then where we showed some discipline, I don't think so.
Interesting.
Or then in 2003, when I worked for the next President Bush, the decision to do the Iraq War. And I remember I was then at the State Department, and I remember my staff was coming in and saying, something's going on. People are like feeling much too cocky around the administration. And I had been quietly arguing that we didn't want to do this. And I had my regular meeting with Condi Rice, who was then the National Security Advisor, and I went in there and I basically said, Condi, I really don't think this is a great idea. In some ways, it's reminiscent of what we went through a decade or so before. Let me just sort of paint the picture. And she said, Richard, save your breath. The president's already made up his mind. And this was in July of 2002, before there had been a National Security Council meeting or anything. And again, I don't think it was axiomatic that another president would have chosen that the United States needed to go into Iraq when we did and how we did it. And I think President Bush 41 got it right, and I think President Bush 43 did not. And I could choose other presidents, because every president invariably is a mixture of things he gets right and things he doesn't. And the only reason I highlight these two, besides that I happen to be a fly on the wall, is that it just shows that, again, so little about history is inevitable. And the good news in that is people can make a difference.
Yeah.
And the not so good news is that people can make a difference.
So I'm struggling now with how to take that through the lens of the current administration.
The point still holds. People can make a difference, yeah.
So maybe we can talk a little bit about the Trump administration, and to what extent is President Trump a kind of a symptom of some of the issues that you talk about in your book, and also some of the deeper economic issues and the trend towards populism, which you touch on as well? How much is he actually an active party in reshaping the environment?
I think it's a great question. It's one I struggle with because it has real implications. Because if the answer to your question, Rana, is that he is largely a reflection of this larger current in history, then it suggests that with or without his own uniqueness, shall we say. How's that? I'm a diplomat by training, by the way.
Yeah, so tactful.
But seriously, with or without his own peculiarities, whatever you want to call it, Trumpism in some form will become the norm. If, however, you think he's largely more the cause than the reflection, then there could be some sort of return to a much more traditional American foreign policy. I actually think that's a critical question. I don't have the answer to it, and I can argue it round or flat. And I think to some extent it may depend upon how long he's in office, what he does, what is the world he hands off to 46, what does that world look like. But my own hunt, look, see, one example, during the campaign, the one issue that Bernie Sanders, Hillary Clinton, and Donald Trump agreed on, opposition to TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And that to me, and Hillary Clinton, I believe, she was one of the architects of it.
Yeah.
But it was a sign of the times. And I think to that extent, Donald Trump represented a kind of frustration. We saw populism, not just in the United States, obviously. We've seen it in the Brexit vote. We've seen it in France and elsewhere. But I do think he is a driver more than he's a reflection. I think his rejection of many of the foundation stones of American world leadership, not simply his questioning of trade, his questioning of alliances, his questioning of most international arrangements, say the Paris Accord, more broadly, his basic view that it just hasn't been worth it, that when you look at the sweep of history since World War II and since the end of the Cold War, that what we've spent, in his view, far outweighs our return on investment, I think is dead wrong. Mm-hmm. But he believes that. But I do think he's more of an exception. I think a chunk of Americans believe that. Mm-hmm. And one of the challenges for people like me and the organization I'm part of is to make the argument that I believe the contrary is true. But I do believe that he thinks that's the case.
So it's interesting because within his administration, it's a little schizophrenic always, right? There's the sort of economic nationalism camp. There's the sort of more mainstream Republican camp, Gary Cohn, Steve Mnuchin, et cetera. I mean, do you see any sort of coherently articulated strategy politically or economically right now? I mean, what is the Trump administration putting forward to a world in disarray, do you think?
Well, the bottom line is they're contributing to it. There isn't... It's very hard for the administration to have a single doctrine or strategy. It's not that it's just too soon, but there are competing centers of power. You've got the formal decision-making process. You have the president's own penchant for informality, shall we say. You've got the role of Jared Kushner, which is an additional decision-making and implementation role. You've got the reality that most of the State Department and the Office of Secretary of Defense are not staffed up. Mm. And none of this is going to change soon. So this is, in that sense, a decentralized, informal administration. If I had to describe the decision-making style, I would call it adhocracy. It's the institutionalization of this kind of combination of informality and improvisation. But it's now institutionalized. So this is unlikely, I would say, to change. And then intellectually, you're right. There are competing schools, but the president clearly leans more in the direction that the status quo is undesirable on balance. You know, I essentially think he should be the preserver-in-chief. He thinks he should be the disruptor-in-chief. Mm. And I believe the balance of the administration favors him. And where the two came together, by the way, both the informality or the ad hocness and the disruption would say be when he went to Europe. And at the last minute, they took out of the draft he was going to give to the Europeans the reaffirmation of Article 5, which is the attack on one is attack on all. The fact that it was taken out after the formal NSC process, and the substance being that we were going to not underscore one of the fundamentals of 70 years of American foreign policy. That, to me, was a moment that was revealing, both in terms of the policy and the process.
So let's talk actually a little bit about the transatlantic relationship. You know, populism everywhere. Brexit, a great example of that. The future of Europe seems very much up in the air to me. You know, on the one hand, Angela Merkel's stronger than she might have been in the past. On the other hand, you've still got these kind of inherent problems with more political cohesion needed, more probably a lot deeper economic cohesion needed to make this work. What will it mean? What do you think is going to happen in Europe? And then B, how will that play into a world in disarray?
Just take a step back. Europe was the principal arena of the 20th century. 2 world wars and a Cold War, and Europe was the principal venue. Europe is still 20 to 25% of world economic output. Europeans collectively spend about $200 billion on defense, so Europe still matters. And Europe has had its most successful era in its entire modern history, the last 300-400 years since World War II. And there were two reasons for it. One was NATO, which kept the peace, and the other was the EU. Began before that, originally as the European Coal and Steel Community, then the European Community. What a creative piece of statecraft it was and is. And the whole idea was to take France and Germany, who had been the two protagonists or antagonists of so much of modern European history, and to integrate them, to so knit them together that war on the European continent would be unthinkable. And it worked. And it was a brilliant creative piece of statecraft. So together, NATO and the EU really worked. And now, We've introduced some doubts about NATO. Russia's reintroduced a geopolitical threat to Europe. Brexit has shaken the EU. I think the most positive development has been Macron's win. If Macron had lost to Le Pen, it would be beyond the world in disarray. But I think Macron's victory really helped stem the momentum coming after the Dutch election as well. And I think the EU faces all sorts of challenges, in particular figuring out the relationship between national capitals and Brussels and what moves forward and what moves back and what's the balance. And I think the EU got ahead of itself when it created a common currency without anything like a parallel fiscal policy. It got out of whack. And so I think Europe has some big issues, and I think Macron and Merkel together now have the bull by the horns, and I think they've got a couple of years to get it right. But they better get it right, because the next time there's a populist challenge in France, it may not be someone with all the baggage of Le Pen. It might just be a pure populist. Yeah. And that person may have a lot of the same views about unraveling the EU and getting out of NATO. So I think Europe's got a few years to get it right, but it faces the consequences of what I think was the terrible decision of Brexit and a problematic Russia, and just the fact that the EU machinery needs to be retuned or reconfigured to fit the reality.
Just to stay on Russia for a moment, I mean, I am personally fascinated by how a country that a few years ago we were writing off as a sort of third-rate petropower is now like, a playa, in all sorts of ways. What do you make of that? How seriously do we need to think about Russia? How do we think about Russia? It's no longer the Cold War relationship, but what is it exactly?
Yeah, you're right. It's not a Cold War relationship. Russia doesn't represent an ideological challenge. It doesn't, in a sense, represent an alternative. It doesn't represent a global challenge, but it represents a challenge in particular two ways. Not so much the petro side. I think given the changes in the energy market, the Russians have lost one of their principal tools, but they've got two pretty powerful tools. One is their military, and we've seen it, and it's not over, by the way. As we sit here, they are still doing things in eastern Ukraine. And they're obviously occupying Crimea. They could do things elsewhere in Europe. We saw what they did in Syria. And all their cyber mischief, what they've done in the United States, what they tried to do or did without the success, quote unquote, they wanted in France. So Russia is a 2.5-dimensional, a 3-dimensional power, military, cyber, and energy. And it's a spoiler. In a funny sort of way, the guy who should be the disruptor in chief, in some ways who is Vladimir Putin. He wakes up every day. He says his goal in life is to reverse the humiliation that was the end of the Cold War. Right. End of the Soviet Union, NATO enlargement, and so forth. He gets up every day, and he doesn't want to make Russia great again, because to make Russia great again, he would have to introduce political and economic reform. And he doesn't want to do that, because that would threaten his absolute hold on power. But he wants Russia to be seen as great again. And he's a spoiler, and he's dangerous for that reason.
And the fact that he doesn't want to do reforms at home means that we should look for him to cause more mischief abroad, continually to take people's eye off of what's not happening at home, yeah?
Russia's been a shrinking economy, as you know, roughly, 8-10% over the last couple of years. You're seeing these protests in Russia, and he gets up every day, interestingly. Not only does he want to do these things abroad, he doesn't take his own situation for granted. One of the reasons I believe he so opposed Hillary Clinton and wanted Donald Trump as president is he saw the revolutions, the sort of thing that happened in Ukraine and so forth. He was worried that these things were going to come to Moscow. One of the reasons he intervened in Ukraine, think about it, a president chased out of the palace by a mob. That might not be a good precedent if you're Vladimir Putin. So I think he worries every day, and he does not want to have a United States that pushes back at him. It's one of the reasons that we may want to push back at him.
Let's talk a little bit about Asia. You have an entire chapter in your book about how the U.S. and China can basically avoid the trap.
I just flew here from China on Saturday.
Oh, fantastic. All right, so fresh news. So yeah, how do we avoid the age-old trap of the emerging power? Yeah, exactly, the emerging power fighting the existing power.
A lot of that out there, several new books about it that are very dark in terms of almost near historical inevitability. That the rising power, China, the existing power of the United States, will end up in a Cold War or worse. I think it's dead wrong. Not to put too fine a point on it. China doesn't have that sort of strategic culture, if you look at Chinese history. China often it wants to spread its influence, but it doesn't have an aggressive strategic culture. If anything, look at what they're doing with the One Belt, One Road. They're actually, in some ways, blending economics and politics to increase their influence. China is very integrated in the global economy. What I just said about Russia doesn't apply to China. China, it is a real economy. And they are very much, their fate depends upon the world. Indeed, it was Deng Xiaoping, when he ran China, who basically articulated the idea that China needed a stable periphery so it could develop economically and politically. I still think that is the case. And the Chinese know that they've got a real dilemma on their hands. The era, and this is a subject of a lot of my conversations in China this past week, the era of high economic growth is over, and it is never to return. You can only pick low-hanging fruit once. You can only bus people from the countryside to the city once. You can't put them on a shuttle. The era of double-digit economic growth is over. But the Chinese have a problem. In order to get higher economic growth, to give people an ever higher standard of living, they got to loosen things up. But to loosen things up, they threaten political control, the role of the party. The word dilemma is one of the most overused words in our business. This is a real dilemma. They know they have a dilemma. They're going to consolidate power this year. They have their 19th Party Congress, late October, early November. That's the last thing they know for sure. What they don't know is what they're going to do once they consolidate power. They haven't figured out the next couple of years about how is the party going to keep legitimacy, how are they going to maintain stability when they no longer have 10% growth to keep people happy.
So how does a rather insecure China then, in some ways, very worried China, looking at these longer term problems, 5-10-year problems, deal with an erratic leader in the US? What does that look like?
It is, I travel a lot given the nature of my job. It is the number 1, 2, and 3 question around the world. People are trying so hard to get a read on us. On the one hand, they're a little bit off balance, and I think there is something to be said tactically on occasion for keeping countries off balance, except if those countries are your friends. You never want to keep your friends off balance because your friends have made the strategic choice to depend on you. But the Chinese and others are trying to get their fix on us. I was in Japan and South Korea as well. Everyone, friend and others alike, are trying to figure. They're also trying to answer your question about whether this is a one-off or this is America going forward, because that has implications. There's an unevenness. They see us getting more involved in the Middle East again, which is not what they expected. We put a greater focus on North Korea, but they're not quite sure what we intend to do about it. We've made life very easy for China in some ways by pulling the plug on the TPP. We've made Asia in some ways safe for Chinese influence. They are trying to get a fix on us. Also domestically, the longest conversation I had was with one of the senior people in China, and we spent half of it talking about China's future, and the other half was about the future of capitalism and democracy. They're looking at the United States, they're looking at Europe. So again, some of the questions you're asking about the future of the EU, about populism, they are trying to understand about how these societies in the West, how are we going to deal with everything from the challenges of populism to the disappearance of certain types of traditional work in manufacturing beyond demographic changes, and what that will mean for us.
Right.
At the same time, they deal with their own challenges. 10-second aside, this is a really interesting moment in history, just because not just what's going on in the world, but what's going on inside societies of virtually every sort. Different things are going on inside these various societies. But this is a moment where there's probably bigger questions about where we're going to be in a generation than almost any time I can think of.
Absolutely. It's interesting. One of the big themes this year at Aspen is technological disruption. And you talked earlier about institutions and the loss of trust in institutions. Well, it seems sometimes that it's institutions versus the internet. And is the internet the new institution? And what does that mean for the world that you've been operating in for several decades?
Every technology that comes along is neither good nor bad, offensive or defensive, whether it's military or civilian. Every technology has multiple facets, depending upon how it's exploited and by whom. So the internet can be a wonderful tool for commerce, for free flow of ideas, for what have you. But then ISIS can use it to inspire and train. So technology breaks in that sense. We saw with the Arab Spring. It can get people into Tahrir Square, but then governments can get on top. So technology is not a determinant. Again, things are not inevitable in there. Technology is simply one of the things out there. But I think the biggest consequences of the internet, all that, are domestic, in that it makes it harder to create community and consensus. I think it reinforces, in the same way that cable does, a kind of narrowcasting, a breakdown of community. We were talking about it somewhere today. When I grew up, the big debate was the melting pot versus the mixing pot. So either way we were together, the question was whether we, I think now there's a third approach, which is separate pots. And I realize this is Colorado, I have to be careful with this word, but I actually think the internet makes it much harder in some ways to create common political space. I thought you were going somewhere else. 30 seconds more?
Yeah.
I think one of the things we also see is problems with wage stagnation and all that.
Yeah.
And the reason I raise it now is the president's response, for the most part, has been to scapegoat two phenomena, immigration and trade. I actually think he's wrong on both. The real driver of the disappearance of most work is technology.
Yeah, for sure.
It's innovation and so forth. And we had better get serious about it. I think it's great that Aspen's focusing on it. The Council on Foreign Relations, I have made this our biggest new focus. Our next big commission or task force is on the implications of technology and the disappearance of work for national security. But I believe the conversations we've had about populism will pale in significance if we don't figure out how to make our societies more adaptable and resilient in the face of these technologies.
So this is great, and I did want to go to this sort of economic angle. Let's play a thought experiment and just say that, all right, historically, technology always creates net more new jobs. We know this. Sometimes it takes a long time. Sometimes there's a period of disruption, as there was in the Industrial Revolution. But right now, it's happening very fast. A lot of smart people, some of them here, think that the kind of disruption, the breadth of disruption, and how far it's going up the white-collar food chain, disrupting some of the jobs that you all have.
That's why they have time to be here now.
Exactly, that's right. In the new world of work, you'll, corporate power as compared to labor power, or even public sector power, is at an all-time high. You've got economic globalization that's really run way ahead of political globalization. That's one of the reasons for some of the problems you're talking about. Where do we go? If none of those vectors really change, what happens?
You're right, by the way. I'll get to your question. Economic globalization has far outpaced the response. And that's true across the board. We've seen it in trade. Take cyber. We don't have the rules and regulations or institutions for governing that. In virtually every area of globalization, the developments have outpaced the response. Indeed, we constantly use the phrase international community. And I hate to be the bearer of bad tidings, but there isn't much of one. If there was, the world would be in much better shape. There'd be much less disarray than there is. I think there can be an international dimension of this, and one thing would be trade agreements do have to take greater issues into a broader range of issues into account. But I think there could also be a kind of international best practices. So, for example, there's a lot of interest in German experience with apprenticeships and so forth. I think it's a useful thing for the G20. If I were putting together a G20 agenda, this is the sort of thing I would have on it. And talk about everything from the pros and cons, I think mainly cons of universal basic income, to looking at various training and education programs, the mobility and portability of various kinds of safety nets. I think it's another argument for corporate tax reform, for infrastructure in this country. But I think the answers are largely domestic, but I think in the trading and investment world and in best practices, there'll be an international overlay.
And do you think that maybe this new globalism is going to look more like regionalism? I mean, actually, just to go to bright spots, one of the bright spots in your book was Latin America. And they've already been through a wave of populism. They're kind of coming out the other end in some ways. Is there, despite our president and the wall and so forth, is there some kind of regionalism that you see developing that could actually, preserve what's good about globalization, but maybe be a little more inclusive and politically acceptable?
It depends. You have to go region by region, because I think one of the realities of the future will have both greater globalization and globalism, but also greater regionalism and localism, and one on the same time. Latin America kind of wins the award as most improved, and you compare Latin America today to 20 years ago, what's so interesting about it is populism, for the most part, has been pushed back. Even in a place like Brazil, which is going through what Brazil's going about, you see the rule of law pushing back against the systemic corruption. There's virtually no geopolitics. I worry about a lot of stuff in the world. I don't worry about Argentina invading Chile. I don't worry about nuclear proliferation in Latin America. You got Venezuela, but I think that's a time-limited challenge. We could create new populism if we're not careful in Mexico, but that's but by and large, Latin America looks pretty good. By contrast, the Middle East was, is, and will be the worst part of the world.
Yeah, spend a couple minutes on that. Tell us your...
That'll really depress people. Look, in order for there to be order in any part of the world, you need two things. You need a balance of power, and you need some consensus among the principal actors as what constitutes, to use Henry Kissinger's word, legitimacy. What are the arrangements that ought to be, and how are they to be set or changed? In the Middle East, you have none of that. You don't have a balance of power, and there's no shared sense of what the region ought to look like, where the borders ought to be, what ought to be the rules. There hasn't been, and there's not going to be for time to come. Indeed, I have two rules about the Middle East. One is the enemy of your enemy is still your enemy. And the second rule of the Middle East is things have to get worse before they get even worse. And I'm a lot of fun, by the way, at dinner parties. The Middle East is about to get worse. Indeed, we are on the brink of the Middle East getting seriously worse. I mean, just think about the last 10 days. You've had the United States and Russia nearly going at it in Syria, United States shooting down a Syrian plane. The whole question of who will control the territory that liberated from ISIS is up for grabs. And you've got an axis of Russia, Syria, and Iran. You got the United States with the Syrian Kurds and different Sunni groups. You got Turkey pushing its own agendas. You got all that. You've got the civil war in Yemen. That's really a proxy war in Yemen. You've got the new leadership in Saudi Arabia. That, shall we say, to use a polite word, is assertive. And the new crown prince, when he was the deputy crown prince just about 6 weeks ago, gave an interview where he talked about taking the war in the Middle East to Iran. You have ISIS now targeting Saudi Arabia increasingly, which I think will happen as ISIS loses its territorial foothold in both Iraq and Syria. I mean, it's funny, for so long we thought the biggest problem in the Middle East was the Israeli-Palestinian problem. It's still a problem, but it's mainly a problem to Israelis and Palestinians. It's not, if you will, a regional problem. We now have regional problems. One other thing.
Yeah.
How do you know the Middle East is bad? When Lebanon looks pretty good.
Oh, boy.
Everything is relative. There you go.
All right, before we open it up for questions, let me just ask one follow-on to that. What, if anything, I mean, putting aside the administration we have now, what, if anything, could the U.S. do to make things better?
Oh, there's lots of things we could do, whether we will or not. I mean, just very quickly, I'll mention a few things. In Europe, strengthen NATO, stop attacking the EU and flirting with anti-EU forces, open up a trade agreement with the EU, talk to the Russians, but be tough with them. In Asia, I would say try, if you can, to get a diplomatic solution to the North Korea issue. We can talk about it. And devote an awful lot of time to trying to develop a relationship with China, which will be the 21st century's defining relationship. Figure out a way to get back into TPP. I have ideas how we could do it, but figure out a way to get back into that. In the Middle East, I would say be very careful about getting too involved. The Middle East has sponged up a disproportionate amount of American global effort for 15 years. I do not think we want to be any more involved than we necessarily have to. Don't pick a major fight with Mexico. Have a real negotiation to modernize NAFTA, not a faux negotiation to destroy it. And spend a lot of time consulting with other governments about what will be the rules of the road for the world. Dealing with cyber, what should be permitted, what is to be pushed back, what kind of activities are to be discouraged, what are the rules for dealing with outbreaks of various types of pandemics, what ought to be doing on climate change, because quite honestly, Paris is not the answer. It's too modest. But what I call, one of the things I argue for in the book, is we need to develop this idea of sovereign obligation. I call it World Order 2.0, a new operating system to help the world cope with these global challenges, which no single country, including the United States, can manage on its own. So there's a big agenda. But none of this will happen by itself. None of it will happen without the United States. So it really would take, I believe, a major rethink. And if Donald Trump is not going to do that, and odds are he won't, then a lot of this may have to wait for his successor, or we have to hope that others, in some ways here and there, step up. But again, there's no other country that's willing and able to play our role. And the world is not a self-ordering system. So if we're on the trajectory we were on, the world, the sequel to this will be a world in much greater disarray, or God forbid, a world in chaos or anarchy. And that is the real argument for the United States to do it, not as a favor to everybody else, as a favor to ourselves. We will not thrive in a world that's unraveling. Nothing stays local for long anymore. So we have enlightened self-interest in playing a large role in the world. Good news is we can afford it, but the bad news is it's not clear we're going to do it anymore.
Okay, that's a good place to open up for the next 15 minutes or so to questions. One here and then back there, and then we'll come to the other side of the room. We've got mic runners.
Did you mention the HBO thing at the end? I will. Richard, Danny Seabright.
Hey, Danny.
The one place you warned us all to stay away from is the Middle East, and we know all the reasons why. But the president, but troops are flowing. Special force, new levels of special forces are going to the Middle East right now, and other unique forces in our armament. And the president and the new crown prince and the king are aligned on their hatred of Iran. And many people, many pundits in Washington are predicting that we're going to be at war with Iran in this president's administration. Can you talk about that a little bit and how that's going to go?
So you thought I was the one who was Debbie Downer here. Well, it's a real concern. It's a real reason to be worried. I think that the president gave too much of a green light to the Saudis and the UAE on his trip to the region. I don't, for the life of me, understand this whole self-generated crisis with Qatar, or Qatar if you prefer. I don't want to get dragged into a war with Iran unless Iran does things that really provoke it. But I think we ought to be living with the nuclear agreement, even though it's not an agreement that I feel wildly enthusiastic about, but we have it. We ought to be thinking really hard about what comes after it, because important parts of it start expiring, probably under the next president. But right now, I don't believe we ought to break it. We ought to be looking for ways we can push back, and I would put the focus right now on Syria. And I would not be sending, by the way, another few thousand troops to Afghanistan. No increased number of troops in Afghanistan will make an enduring difference, so long as, among other things, Afghan politics remain they are, and Pakistan continues to provide a sanctuary for the Taliban. I would be focusing on what we do to solidify those areas of Syria we liberate so people can live there. I mean, more than half of Syria's population is homeless. So we ought to not solve the Syrian problem, but at least try to stabilize limited areas of it. But that's about it. I mean, again, we've got big issues in Asia. We have got big issues in Europe. The great powers are the greater powers are still China and Russia. And I think we need to have some sense of strategic proportion. We can't do everything everywhere. And I think that we've got to show much greater discipline in the Middle East and understand that the ambitions of Saudi Arabia and the UAE may not, shall we say, align 100% with ours.
Okay. There was a question right there, and then we'll go over to this side.
Hi, Mr. Haass. My name is Alfred Fuente. In your opinion, did President Obama's decision not to enforce the red line in Syria have a direct impact on Russia's decision to meddle in our election, where they said, look, if they're not going to enforce their own red line, then we can really push as hard as we can and get away with it and not really get any brushback. And also, to your point about pushing back on Russia and its influence and interference in our election, what would you advise? Should we,
Got it.
advise currency traders to, short the Russian ruble and devalue their currency and just break their economic
Got it.
back?
On the former, the honest answer is I don't know. As I said before, the Russian energy tool has lost a little bit of its salience, so I think they've been looking for other ways to make a difference. I think the red line decision was an extraordinarily consequential mistake by Barack Obama that raised questions around the world about American reliability. I also think it dramatically weakened the norm that we ought to be promoting, that no weapon of mass destruction ought to be used by anyone, anywhere, at any time. So I think when historians write the history of the Obama presidency, that will be towards the top of the list of historic errors, or what Bismarck would have called a blunder. But I can't sit here and tell you that that's what specifically led to my hunch is it probably would have happened anyway, given that, again, given more the configuration of Russian power and their concerns about American, what the United States seeks to do. What I would do is I would talk to the Russians about Syria. I would talk to them about European security, but I would look for ways to, without in any ways undermining their legitimacy, among other things, I would be looking for ways to support political and economic openness in Russia. I would be strengthening NATO. It's almost the opposite of the Cold War, where we had a policy of linkage, where everything was tied together. I would basically work with the Russians where it was in our interest to work with them, and they were prepared to meet us on terms we could accept. And I would push back at them, including at Putin's domestic position. I don't see when bad things happen, whether it was in Iran in the Green Revolution 5 years ago or in Russia today. Why don't we stand up and say what we believe in? I think this whole idea, as the Secretary of State articulated, of a valueless foreign policy, I'm a card-carrying realist, but I think they've taken that way too far. We ought to stand up for things we believe.
Okay, question here.
You might want to wait for a microphone so
Oh, yeah.
people can hear you. Otherwise, you'll have to depend on me for repeating your question, and I'll mangle it.
Muzaffer Şener from Turkey. My question is about the sins or mistakes of the American foreign policy in terms of the global order. Could you list some of them about what is the big mistakes that done by the Americans in
About
terms
what?
of
The major American sins of foreign policy
sins of American foreign policy or mistakes? Which
Okay.
one you
Okay, I thought we sort of covered it, but look.
regarding to, let's say, the stable world order?
Well, again, commission, I would say, going into Iraq in 2003, going into Libya under Obama, saying Mubarak must go, not following it up, saying Assad must go, not following it up, taking U.S. forces out of Iraq, putting U.S. forces in Afghanistan on a timetable, taking the United States out of TPP by this president, raising questions about allied relationships, taking the United States out of the Paris Agreement. I got a long list. That's not even half of it. So yeah, I actually think we haven't, again, coming back to your basic question, Rana, things are afoot structurally, historically. Rise of China, globalization. If the United States had done nothing wrong, it would have been a really challenging inbox.
Yeah.
But that wasn't enough for us. We have gone out of our way to add to our own inbox in ways that I would think historians of the future will find head-scratching.
Let's take a question back there, right, just in the back, and then we'll come over here.
Thank you. You have worked with 4 presidents, you said, so you know the inside workings. I would be curious to hear your take on evaluating the president's team that he's established.
Good question.
Well, I think you got to look at 2 things. One is the team, and the other is how the structure. And I've already criticized the structure. I think it is a recipe for disaster to have multiple centers of authority, to have uncertain lines of authority, to have formal meetings followed by informal meetings, to not know who's in. This is a recipe for disaster. So I think this administration is doing itself a disservice. I think this administration faces an additional challenge, which is virtually no one in the administration has any interagency experience. No one has sat around the Situation Room table. Some of them have never been in government before, including the president and the Secretary of State. So this is an administration that begins with serious, I think, if you will, background or historic disadvantages. But then if you know that coming in, this ought to be the most tightly structured administration going to compensate for it. Instead, it's the most loosely structured administration I've seen. That's a really bad combination.
Okay, question over here, and then we're going to give Richard a chance to have a few final words.
Yeah, I'll save all the happy stuff for the end.
Dana Montenegro, thank you for being here.
Thank you.
In the spirit of the enemy of my enemy is still my enemy, which, by the way, would make a tremendous T-shirt for yourself. Do we make an enemy of Iran? Are they necessarily our enemy? Have we not just pushed them into a corner? And what, are there mistakes that we've made that we could go back and rectify? And is there the potential for a detente? Or is this just a problem we're stuck with and we have to wait for it to play out?
Great question. Look, I think Iran is particularly difficult for several reasons. One is it's not a normal country in the sense that you have a hybrid political authority. I don't know any other country quite like it with religious authority and political authority. And so you can't speak of Iran almost as a singular actor. You then within Iran have various constituencies, the guards and others. It's, again, and they have different agendas. I think Iran is an imperial power. I don't think it is a status quo power. It has many tools. It has the organs of government, but it also has proxies like Hezbollah. It works through local Shia populations. So Iran is a complicated challenge. Can we work out a modus vivendi? I don't know. I think it would take a mixture of a willingness to talk. For example, I was involved in something with Iran directly where it actually worked, which was after 9/11. Iran actually played a constructive role in putting together a post-Taliban government in Afghanistan. Reason was in part that Iran had a self-interest. Millions of young Iranians were paying a price because of drugs coming from Afghanistan into Iran. Iran actually saw a reason to help bring about a more stable political authority. So on that occasion, Iran played a helpful role. On other occasions, one would obviously say different things. I'm pretty non-ideological in foreign policy. So my view is to be aware of what they are, work with them as best you can. I think we're going to have big areas of disagreement. As I said, we have a coming area of enormous potential disagreement. What is it now? It's 2017. In 8 years from this summer, the limits on centrifuges established in the nuclear agreement expire. 13 years from this summer, all the ceiling on fissile material expire. What then? What is the follow-on agreement to the U.S., to the nuclear agreement, the joint agreement on Iran? Big question. So I think this is going to be a problematic relationship, but I think we, as a result, ought to be very careful about aligning ourselves with the Saudis so narrowly, simply because for them, this is the defining issue. I think it had a lot to do with why they went into Yemen. And again, I don't want this to become the defining fault line of American foreign policy. We have bigger fish to fry. I think we have bigger fish to fry in Europe. We have bigger fish to fry in Asia. We have bigger fish to fry globally. So my view would be to do what is necessary vis-a-vis Iran and the Middle East, but no more than that. So for example, when I read the other day that several senators stood up and said, we ought to articulate a policy of regime change in Iran.
Oh, man.
This is the new word of wisdom coming off of Capitol Hill. I hear that and just go, wow, given the totality of American foreign policy, is this really what you want to do? I'll be uncharacteristically modest. Not obvious to me that is where we ought to be going with American foreign policy. We didn't even do that with the Soviets, even under containment. Yeah. The goal was, the emphasis was containment. Now, Kennan said, if we are successful at containing the Soviets, over time, Soviet policy will not be able to deal with that frustration, and there will be a mellowing. And guess what? Kennan was right. So it's quite possible, if we deal with Iran successfully for a generation or two, and look, the most recent election, without exaggerating it, Rouhani's forces got 60%. Yeah. For all I know, in 5 or 10 years, he or someone like him will get 70% or 80%. I don't see why we want to create a near-term crisis with Iran, particularly given that our partners in the region, shall I say, are limited in their capabilities.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with that, actually. So before I ask a final question, I just want to mention that Richard's book, A World in Disarray, is actually going to be turned into an HBO documentary, been done with Vice as well. Yeah. So that's July 21st, is that right? July 21st?
On a TV screen coming to you.
On a TV screen coming to you. Millennials, watch closely. The pictures move quickly. It's very Vice-like. So let's just have a final question in the last minute here. Richard, you made what I thought was a very powerful point for a book on foreign policy that, you know what, before we can do really much else on the foreign policy front, we need to fix what's going on at home. And in just a minute or so, give us 3 things, hopefully within the realm of the real in this political environment, that we could be doing.
Well, you put that caveat on it, which makes it. My last book was called Foreign Policy Begins at Home, just for that region. I think what happens here has tremendous implications, but I would basically be careful about growing the national debt. We have to be very, very careful because that will make us incredibly vulnerable to what goes on in markets or what central bankers wake up. We really want to do something about infrastructure. It'll make us much more competitive. It'll employ a lot more people. It'll make us more resilient in the face of terrorism or anything else. But I think the most basic point is I think we've got to educate Americans. And I made the biggest project. I mean, one of the central things we now do, here's the council, we're 100 years old, this so-called elite institution. But I have made my personal priority promotion in our schools and colleges, what I call global literacy. Americans need to understand more about the world, given our impact on the world and the world's impact on us. We are graduating a generation of people, even from our elite institutions, who don't know nearly enough, if anything, about the world and its implications for them. So what we have got to do is become globally literate in this country so we understand the implications of American foreign policy and the implications of the world for ourselves.